I'm fully aware that dynasty values are about to experience a massive change once the actual NFL season ends, but if you're new to dynasty and you're about to draft in a startup draft, or you're just making trades in your first official offseason, you need to know that there are fraudulent values out there right now on certain players that we just need to go through today. So just make sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel to show your support. So get into our first guy right here. I've got Anthony Richardson. Anthony Richardson should not be valued where he's currently being valued, particularly in startup drafts. And here's the deal with these startup draft values, right? A lot of times startup draft values end up being correlated to values on the trade market in Dynasty Fantasy Football. And right now, Anthony Richardson is 52.3 ADP. That is the 52nd player off the board in traditional Dynasty startup drafts. This is absolutely not what his real worth is right now. So, of course, obviously, I'll start with just the fact that I particularly had high hopes on Anthony Richardson this season, along with a lot of other people. This is honestly a guy that I saw as a potential next Cam Newton. This guy has a cannon for an arm. He could throw through a brick wall, and it's so unlike anybody that we've seen in today's NFL. He just has so much arm strength, and obviously the rushing upside is really ridiculous with Anthony Richardson. I saw Cam Newton in there with this guy. He was a 4th to 5th rounder in redrafts leagues as well, so obviously the expectations were just not on myself. They were obviously along with other people for the ride. It just didn't work out. He was disgraceful. It was horrific to watch what Anthony Richardson did to so many fantasy teams and so many dynasty teams this particular season. He was the quarterback 25 in 2024. Now, of course, there's a caveat here, I guess, which is the fact that he only played 11 games. So you can't expect him to be a top 12 quarterback, a top 10 quarterback with only 11 games out of 17 that were played. But here's the more defining characteristic here. The more defining statistic is that he only had 15.9 fantasy points per game. He was absolutely horrific, guys. There was only a couple really big games in his game log that he actually was able to record. Other than that, it was super disappointing. Now, I don't even think that even tells the full story of how bad it got for Anthony Richardson. So obviously he plays really bad. If you're actually watching the guy play, he played really bad, and I would say inconsistent is a very generous word to offer up for Anthony Richardson's play in 2024. He's also constantly dealing with injuries. He's got a back injury this week. He's got a hip injury the next week, then an oblique injury. He's had so many injuries in his first 2 seasons as an NFL player. It's just not good. And then he obviously, the major headline is he gets benched for pulling himself out of a game. Whether you believe that was right or wrong of the Colts to bench him, that's the reality, is that his confidence was absolutely shot after getting benched. And I would say worst of all, like whether or not you think it was a good idea to bench him, I personally think it was the right move. He was just bad. I mean, 8 touchdowns and 12 interceptions, and I think the most telling statistic of all is 47.7% completion percentage was what Anthony Richardson had in 2024. That is flat out just not sustainable. You cannot sustain being a starting quarterback in the NFL when your completion percentage is, let alone below like 64%, he's below 50%, man. No quarterback can survive that type of play. I'm not saying his career is over. That's not what I'm trying to say here in this particular segment right now. I even saw that he's working with Josh Allen's mechanics coach this offseason that helped Josh Allen get from a really low completion percentage in his first 2 years to a pretty high one. Now he's sustainable. Obviously, he's the second best quarterback in the NFL today. But a horrendous completion percentage like 47.7% usually just doesn't get 20% better. Like, I just do not see him leaping from 47.7% to like 65% completions. I just do not think that happens within the next 1 to 2 years, because let's face it, he's on a really tight time schedule at this point, because I don't know if the Colts can take much more of him doing what he's been doing. And combine that with the injury history that this guy has, he's just certainly not worth a 5th rounder in startup drafts and will not go anywhere near that in trade value. If he has been traded this offseason, you already know that you're getting a lot less if you're trying to get value in return from Anthony Richardson. And moving on to number 2, I've got Javonte Williams of the Denver Broncos, currently right now sitting here at 74.3 ADP in startup drafts right now. So Javonte Williams, I wouldn't say I had high hopes for him, but I definitely did have some low-key hopes for Javonte Williams that he could become the guy that we actually saw the rookie year that he had with Denver and that second year until he absolutely screwed his career up by tearing that ACL. Last offseason, I made a video about unexpected league-winning running backs. This particular research that I did for that video helped me find Chuba Hubbard this year, helped me find Chase Brown this year. That research also led me to Javonte Williams, and he fit the criteria. It just didn't play out that way. He was atrocious in 2024. 139 carries, 513 yards, and 4 rushing touchdowns. That's 3.7 yards per carry, man. This guy has just simply not been the guy that he once was before the injury. It has absolutely had a massive effect on the trajectory of his career. And 6 games with at least 4 yards per carry is all he was able to muster up in 2024. So it's not like he had, just a ton of volume and he was just not getting as many yards per carry, because usually that's how it goes when you get so much volume. It wasn't like that, man. He only had 6 games with 4.4 yards per carry. Now, he's not expected to re-sign in Denver. That's already been reported this offseason. And obviously, I think a lot of people can draw that conclusion based on what he did in 2024. He was so bad. And I really can't imagine that he gets another lead back opportunity with any other team in the NFL. I just don't see an NFL team staking their future at the running back position. We've learned how valuable the running back position is, especially this year with the resurgence of running backs. You cannot go into a season as an NFL team with Javonte as your lead guy. So I just don't think that he's anywhere near worth his ADP. I think he's actually even less worth his ADP than Anthony Richardson is. I could understand trading maybe a second rounder or maybe a pair of second rounders for Anthony Richardson to see if he can pop in his third year. But with Javonte Williams, he is not worth anything more than a third rounder in trades, maybe. And definitely not worth taking in the top half of Dynasty startup drafts. Now, the next guy on here is obviously a huge name. He's been great. He'll be a Hall of Famer someday. But I think the time has come where you cannot take Tyreek Hill in the top 12 picks of your Dynasty startup drafts. And definitely not be giving, multiple first rounders in the trade. And top 12 in ADP. In startup drafts. That usually equates to multiple first rounders in trades in Dynasty Fantasy Football. Even before 2024 happened, I thought that was a particularly bad idea. The guy was 30 years old heading into the season, and I just didn't think that it would be a particularly good idea to give up tons of draft capital to get a guy who is definitely at that age cliff right there. I just think it's really bad business now. Obviously, we saw what he did in 2024. 81 receptions, 959 yards, 6 touchdowns on 123 targets. So he was still being targeted out the wazoo. He was getting tons of targets in Miami. It was an overall weird year for Miami, right? Tyreek Hill obviously has a really bad season for his standards, not atrocious, but definitely for his standards really bad. And it was obviously, like I said, a weird year for Miami in general. Tua obviously misses 6 games in the 2024 season, and the backups were awful. They couldn't sustain anything with Tyler Huntley at quarterback, with Skylar Thompson at quarterback. It didn't matter. They were just not good and not sustainable offensively with either of those two guys. And Tyreek Hill, I do think it's worth noting this one right here. He did deal with a wrist injury for basically the entire season. Obviously, we saw that video with him and the police officer before week 1, and I think that's where he said, if I'm not mistaken, that he did get that wrist injury from. So if that's the case, that he had been dealing with that wrist injury the entire season. And I think that was probably a big result of why he didn't get more than 3 games with 100-yard receiving performances. That's just, again, not up to Tyreek Hill's standards right there. As far as I can tell, if you watch the guy on film, the speed is still there. The speed is not an issue. I think he still absolutely has that speed. But it's really hard to catch the ball with a bad wrist. And I think that ultimately, moving forward, there's several concerns here that I particularly have. So I did a video last offseason about the age cliff for wide receivers in fantasy football. And what I found is that most wide receivers, they just don't recover when they fall off at age 30 or beyond. They do not recover and have another top 12 season at any point in their career. It's very, very rare. And then you add on top of the fact that this guy's already said he's disgruntled in Miami. He said he's like, after the last game, literally the post-game locker room, interview that he got, he was like, yeah, I'm out of here. And then obviously they've had to backtrack and be like, oh, he's just joking around. He's really not that serious about it. It's like the guy is clearly disgruntled in Miami, but he's under contract through 2026. I think the potential that he gets traded out of Miami is definitely possible, but it likely will not it will just not translate to him being a great fantasy option regardless. So at this point in time, definitely is not worth a top 3 to 4 draft pick in your fantasy drafts as a dynasty startup, and it's definitely not worth a first rounder or more in dynasty trades. Now get into our next guy, also in a very similar career trajectory right now, Debo Samuel. Debo Samuel is ADP in startup drafts, is 55.3 overall. I just don't think that's a good idea. And I don't think, again, that it will absolutely be the case when the actual NFL season starts. I don't think it'll be anywhere near this right now. But again, if you're new and if you're drafting today or tomorrow, or whenever you're drafting before the actual NFL season's over, you're going to see him valued right here. Speaking of that age clip video I was just talking about with Tyreek Hill, I actually feel more confident Debo is done being great than I do feel about Tyreek Hill. This guy was the wide receiver 44 with 8.5 fantasy points per game in 2024. Now, one of the things you kind of have to equate with Debo Samuel that you don't necessarily with Tyreek Hill or really any other top-end wide receiver for that matter is the fact that Debo Samuel has always scored his fantasy points in multiple different ways. He's absolutely been a dominant running back type of hybrid for San Francisco over the years of his career, as well as being a great wide receiver in some areas. This guy had 200-yard performances in 2024 and only 6 double-digit fantasy point games in 2024. 6 double-digit performances in 2024. That's just not enough. And I think that the problem, particularly with Debo, is that unlike Tyreek Hill, he's got such a lengthy injury history in the NFL. And when you just look at Debo Samuel's career, he's only had 2 top 12 seasons in a half PPR scoring format. 2. I mean, that's just not that many. And then you look at it outside of that, it's not like this guy has had a wide receiver 18 season, a wide receiver 21 season, a wide receiver 15 season, or anything like that. This guy has, outside of that, no seasons inside the top 30. Outside of those top 2, top 12 performances, no seasons inside the top 30. So boom or bust. And we've obviously always known that about Debo. But I think when you put it in that perspective, it should just show you that at this age, at 29 years old, even though San Francisco just vocally committed to him, John Lynch just did that with the San Francisco 49ers. I just think that when you combine the age with the history and put it in that perspective that he has not had a top 30 season unless he's been in the top 12 only twice, I just don't think you can invest very highly in a dynasty league at this point, and he cannot be a top 5 player on your dynasty team anymore, or else your team is just not making the playoffs. And our last guy that I want to go through here today, it's obviously going to require some nuance. There's going to be people mad at me in the comments about this. Let's have a discussion about it. I'm always willing to do that. Marvin Harrison Jr. Let me get this straight really quick. I love Marvin Harrison Jr. I was big on him last offseason, calling him the best wide receiver prospect I've seen since Jamar Chase. Had very high hopes for him, as many people did in both Dynasty and in redraft. Everybody thought he was a pro-ready prospect that immediately be an 1,100, 1,200-yard receiver. I'm not saying even close that his career was over. Not even close right now. He flashed those dominant moments that we expected, just more on a bigger level. He only flashed them at a couple different times this year, but it was absolutely still in his arsenal. It just didn't meet expectations, and I think that's important to outline. So he was the wide receiver 29 in what I believe is very noteworthy, a very particularly weak wide receiver scoring season in fantasy football. This is something that I'll make more videos on down the road as we get into more of the research and more of the looking back portion of 2024. But 2024 was just not a good wide receiver scoring year in fantasy football. Will that continue? Probably not. There's always a pattern with running backs and wide receivers. Wide receivers just ended up having the off year in fantasy football. But that's my point, is even in an off year, he couldn't even crack top 25 wide receivers in fantasy football. 62 receptions, 885 yards, and 8 touchdowns on a really crazy 116 targets. He was only catching half of the passes thrown to him. That's like really alarming right there. So where does this leave Marvin Harrison Jr., right? Like I said, I still like the player. I still like the prospect. I still think he has bright moments in the future with him. So let's go through what we do know right now. What we absolutely know is he was the number 2 target behind Trey McBride for the Arizona Cardinals, but the number 1 wide receiver in Arizona. And what we also can look back to is let's just look at Kyler Murray and what he's been able to do with fantasy football wide receivers over Kyler's career. Kyler Murray has only supplied 1 top 15 season for a wide receiver in fantasy football, and that was DeAndre Hopkins in 2020 as the wide receiver 7. Outside of that, no top 15 finishes. So this is obviously something that everybody knows. Quarterback is so important for wide receivers. Nobody will debate that. It's indisputable how important it is. So here's my point, is I don't question whether Marvin Harrison Jr. will continue to be the wide receiver 1 in Arizona. There's too much draft capital attached to the guy. He flashed too much. He's absolutely going to be a lock in 2025 and beyond probably for 115 targets at the very minimum. But what my point is here is that you're lying to yourself if you would still say to this day that you'd rather have Marvin on your dynasty team than Malik Nabers or even Brian Thomas Jr. You're lying to yourself if you're convincing yourself of that. So my point here is that he is not worth the top 10 value, and he is 7.4 ADP in dynasty startups right now. That is simply not worth the cost. And I'm not even saying that he can't get back to that level, but in Dynasty, you have to take advantage of the opportunity because it's so much like the stock market. You buy in on Marvin Harrison low, but you cannot buy in him on this price right here in Dynasty drafts or in Dynasty trades. So let me know what you think of these players' prices in Dynasty in the comments below. And if you want to see some rookie research on the top wide receivers in this class, click on this video right here.